Hello everyone, this is Ted Bauman, editor of the Bauman Letter at Banyan Hill Publishing. This is the second installment in a video series that I'm doing about the effect of limited competition, rigged markets, crony capitalism, whatever you want to call it, on us as consumers, as workers, and as investors. This week I want to talk about the concept of monopoly, related concepts, and also explain what that's doing to the United States economy. But first, let's review a few facts. Last week, I explained that the limited competition, the imperfect market structures, crony capitalism in the United States cost the average U.S. family about $5,000 a year. That's $100 a week. Now, that's excess profits that the companies that we're buying things from, not in every sector, but in some very significant ones, are getting from us because they have rigged the way markets work. Not because they've earned it, not because they're clever, not because their CEOs or their founders have particularly good business acumen, but simply because they figured out ways to take more money from us than competitive markets would allow them to do. Now, in order to understand how that works, let's first talk about the concept of monopoly. Now, monopoly is obviously more than a board game, and it's obviously more than just taking extra money out of your pocket. Let's look at a graph that shows what monopoly can do to the economy. As you can see, one of the key things about monopolies that I've already explained is that they can set any price they choose. For example, healthcare companies, pharma companies that have a control over medicines can basically charge whatever price they like. Yesterday, I saw a news article about a company that has produced a heart cardiac treatment that they're selling for $25,000 a year. So that's a case of a company with a monopoly charging what they want to charge. The second problem is that they can supply inferior products. If you haven't noticed, a lot of the key things that we consume in the United States today are coming at a lot less pleasant. They're becoming less pleasant than they have been in the past. I know when I pick up the phone and call a big company today, it's a lot worse than it was 10 years ago. All those call trees, all that kind of stuff, they're allowed to do those things because we don't have a choice but to put up with it. The third thing is that companies that are making monopoly profits, excess profits, really don't have any incentive to innovate. And one of the problems in the pharma sector, for example, is that companies that are making huge amounts of money from existing drugs may not invest in producing drugs for other conditions that they don't think are going to produce good profits for them. And the last thing is, of course, that monopolies can charge higher prices, which leads to inflation. Now, let's look next at a chart that shows how monopoly comes about. One way is simply that the number of companies in the United States has declined. The number of companies that are publicly listed on the stock exchange in the United States peaked in about 1996 at just over 8,000 firms. Right now, well, a little bit, this chart ends in 2016, but it's about the same. It's right around 4,000 firms. So basically, the number of companies listed on the stock exchange has been cut by half. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. It's not all about unfair competition. Some of it is just about the fact that it's much more difficult to start a new business in the United States than it used to be. But the result of this is my third chart. If you look at what's happened over the similar time frame, concentrate on the yellow and blue columns. The top 1% of households have increased their share of income from 14% to 22%. And a lot of those families have done so by being owners of these big companies, these big concentrated industrial companies. The share of earnings going to the top 100 U.S. firms has gone from 53% in 1995 to 84% in 2015, and it's gone up significantly since then over the last 4 years. The ratio of CEO pay to worker pay since 1995 has gone from 112 times to 272 times. But look at 1975. The average CEO in 1975 only earned 25 times what the average shop floor worker earned. Now it's 272. Now, all of this is essentially an outcome of the concentration of U.S. firms, the concentration of markets, the fact that we have fewer and fewer companies that dominate the supply of essential things in the United States. Now, I want to explain this week how this concentration, this limiting of competition has produced this result. Now, to do that, let's first start with some economic theory. Now this chart shows you essentially a continuum in terms of both industry concentration and investment in research and development. It's just one that I found that I think expresses the problem with monopoly and concentration fairly adequately. In pure competition, there's not much R&D and investment because essentially it's difficult for firms to generate additional cash that they can use to research and develop new techniques. But as an industry becomes more concentrated, as you have fewer firms that are competing against each other over time, those firms begin to generate just enough additional profit that they can afford to invest in research and development. And then that's what they do, and they have to do it because if they don't, they'll get crushed by their competition. But as you can see, eventually you get to the point where research and development goes down again. And that's what we call an oligopoly situation. Oligopoly is a fancy word. It simply means that there are few firms that control the market. And the reason that R&D expenditure goes down in an oligopoly is because firms no longer need to do it in order to be able to keep market share and to keep their profits. They've gotten so powerful that they don't need to develop new products or improve their existing products. They can simply charge more for the products that they already have. Eventually, you get to a pure monopoly situation, and at that point, R&D begins to tail away to nothing because you take what you get. Basically, consumers are forced to buy from the only supplier in town. Now, that's the economic theory behind it, and I've used research and development as an example, but you could also look at things like price, product quality, etc. It's similar for all of those things. As companies, as markets become more competitive, they tend to produce better results than when they become less competitive. Now, one of the critical things about non-competitive markets is that they encourage something called rent seeking. And rent seeking is not about trying to become a landlord or something like that. Rent seeking is essentially the excess money that businesses can charge you as a result of controlling something and having limited competition in their markets. It arises when the owners of a business can act as a toll booth. For example, if you look at the telecommunications industry, the cell industry, internet communications, in my town, I really only have two choices. It's either Verizon or AT&T or Comcast. And of those three, only two of them supply internet. So if I want to buy an internet package in Atlanta, I really only have two choices. And of course, those choices are more expensive and of lower quality than they would be if there was more competition. Take the example of healthcare. Now, in healthcare, as I've just showed you, it's possible for pharmaceutical companies to charge outrageous prices for medicines. In fact, one of the reasons for that is because the US government, Congress, has essentially forbidden the Medicare system from negotiating prices with big pharmaceutical companies. So there you have two examples. One, an example of limited competition. One, an example of how regulators basically bend over backwards to try to please certain industries, and both of them produce higher than usual profits. Now, sometimes lack of competition and market imperfection is unavoidable. For example, in electricity, you can't have 15 or 20 different electricity companies competing to serve a big city like mine here in Atlanta. You can't have 15 or 20 different sets of power cables going to each household. So it's a natural monopoly, and it's something that has been around for a long time. And in that kind of a situation, you treat it as a utility, a regulated utility. So here in the South, we have a company called the Southern Company that supplies electricity to most of the major markets here. And they operate under regulation. They're allowed to make a decent profit, but the critical thing is that they're not allowed to abuse their market position. Now, rent seeking. Rent seeking is essentially when a company or an entrepreneur or anybody is trying to engineer a situation where they can extract excess profit from us. Now, I've given you a couple of different examples, but let me show you the result of that in the United States. First of all, the Economist, which is one of the most pro-capitalist and conservative magazines in the world, recently did a study where they showed the role of rent seeking, which is basically trying to engineer a situation where you can get additional profits out of consumers to pad your pockets, the role that it's played around the world and in the United States. They found that up to 25% of the wealth of the world's billionaires is a result of rent seeking. In other words, trying to rig markets, trying to get favors from politicians, trying to limit competition in some way. In the United States, the figure is 35%. Now, let's look at a chart that they generated. They went to Forbes magazine, looked at the top billionaires in the world, and they analyzed which of those billionaires and their fortunes came from competitive markets, which is the blue columns, versus non-competitive, in other words, rent-seeking behavior. And they looked at the role of technology in it. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of rent-seeking profit going on these days, and that's fine. That's what we want to see in a capitalist economy that's competitive. But if you look at the red and light red parts of the bars, you can see that the amount of profit as a percentage of GDP going to rent-seeking billionaires is rising, and one of the biggest drivers is in the technology sector. Now, at the bottom, they show a number of countries in terms of the percentage of GDP that is generated by firms that are controlled by these billionaires, and the percentage of it that is generated by people who are seeking rent and people who are not seeking rent. No surprise there, Russia is essentially a gangster economy. Almost all of the economic activity associated with the very wealthy is as a result of rent seeking, which is rigging markets, getting politicians to do what you want. Sweden, on the other hand, has a huge number of wealthy people who have made their wealth through honest competition. When you get to the United States, you can see that we also have a fair number of honest millionaires who have come by their wealth through competition and hard work. But we also have a significant number of rent-seeking billionaires, people who have made lots of money not because they're producing a better mousetrap, but because they are in a position to either limit competition or get favors from politicians. Now, let's look at a chart that shows the market share for the 4 biggest firms in select industries in the United States. At the bottom is commercial banking. And commercial banking, the figure would actually be a lot higher if you were looking at national investment banks. Really, on Wall Street, there are only 4 big banks that matter. The reason that figure is much lower is because there are a lot of regional and state level banks in the United States. But still, 25% is pretty high for the top 4. Health and medical insurance and hospital groups, 34% covered by the 4 largest firms. And that includes both insurers and also hospital and physician groups. Wired telecommunications, that's your landline, things like that. 51% controlled by the 4 biggest firms. Cable and other subscription, almost 60%. Air transportation, 65%. And look at wireless telecommunications. Basically, the big thing that's coming, the 5G, all that, 90% of wireless in the United States is controlled by 4 big firms. Now, the reason I run this past you today is because I want you to understand that there is a logical economic reason why lack of competition leads to excessive profits, lower levels of service, worse quality, and lower levels of research and economic dynamism than you would see in a purely competitive market. Now, markets can't always be purely competitive, as I explained in the case of electricity, but there are many other cases. The critical thing we're going to be examining from next week onward, starting with healthcare, is how the systems are set up deliberately to preserve the excess profits, the economic rent that accrues to firms that are not competitive. And as you know, when they get at excess money, they can recycle some of it back into lobbying, which allows them to keep it and entrench their monopolies and their lack of competition. So, next week, healthcare. For this week, this is Ted Bauman, editor of the Bauman Letter. Be sure to go to the Banyan Hill website, link below, and look at the Bauman Letter. If you haven't seen it before, it's my investment newsletter where I recommend companies that are going about their business in an honest way and generating good profits that can benefit you. So, Ted Bauman signing off until next week. Thank you.